get going. Okay, Mary, why don't we show we're going to call the meeting to order at 4:01 p.m. And we do have quorum. And our first action is to approve the minutes from the August 18th meeting. And for that, anybody have any comments or clarifications of the minutes as they were issued? And once again, great job on those. Thank you, Marion. No? Okay, having no comments or questions, clarifications, can I get a move it to approve the minutes? Can someone nominate that? Motion, I mean, sorry.
John Nauman here. I would move to approve the minutes.
Thanks, John. Can I get a second?
This is Malcolm. I'll second.
Thanks, Malcolm. Okay. And all those in favor say aye. Say aye.
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 Okay. Anybody opposed? Please say nay. And that passes unanimously. All right, great. And again, thanks, Ryan. Those were excellent notes. Okay, so let's go into section 3 now, public participation. Public participation enables the public to address the commission about an item that is not on the agenda. If you wish to address the commission, please state your name and address for the record. The Arizona open meeting law prohibits the commission from discussing or taking action on an item which is not listed on the prepared agenda. The commission members may, however, respond to criticism made by those addressing the commission, ask staff to review a matter, or ask that a matter be placed on a future agenda. Public comments should be limited to 3 minutes reading time. So do we have any public participation at this point?
John Nauman here. As a member of the public, I would just like to take a minute to again thank this city staff in the stormwater area for their fast action on getting the retention basins at the Y. And related to that, I don't know if we can get a status report on where that is in terms of completion and that kind of stuff and how it will work and that kind of thing. And also I'd like to ultimately get a status report on the drainage situation at 180 and Schultz Creek. And that's all I have to say.
All right, thanks, John. I think we might be able to get a little bit of information on the basins maybe during the items in section 6. So, but yeah, excellent news article on that and excellent action by the team. That's for sure. Any other public comments at this point?
I have one, if I can go now. So, hi, good afternoon, commissioners. I'm Tamara Lawless. I'm the Water Conservation Manager at City of Flagstaff, and I'm just giving you a short update that our team is coming forth to City Council next month on October 4th to just give a very brief update on how things have been going on implementing our strategic plan, which was adopted in December of 2020. And then we are going to bring that same update to the Water Commission either at your October or November meeting, depending on when the agenda can accommodate that. So just wanted to give you a heads up that will be at council and that you will also be seeing it soon. Likely you'll hear it from my colleague, Emily, who will be filling in as acting water conservation manager when I'm on parental leave. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tamara. Any other participation? All right, seeing none, let's close out item 3 and we'll move forward to item 4, new business. And item 4, letter A, is pre-treatment code changes. Jolene Montoya. Okay, Jolene.
Hi, give me 1 second. I'm going to share a little PowerPoint I have. Can you see my screen for the PowerPoint?
Yeah, that's good.
All right, thank you so much. Hi, good afternoon, commission members. My name is Jolene Montoya. I am the Industrial Pretreatment Supervisor for Water Services. My section monitors all the businesses and industries in town to protect our wastewater collection system and water reclamation plants. So today I am here to bring proposed changes to the commission before I go to the city council. What I am proposing is 3 changes to language found in our sewer use ordinances. So on June 7th, a company called PG Environmental, who was a contractor hired by ADEQ, they visited Flagstaff to conduct a pre-treatment compliance inspection. So this entailed a bunch of records reviews of our pre-treatment program, which included all our 4 industries, their permits, their compliance status, lab reports, all those things having to do with the permits we issue. So during his inspection, he found 3 pieces of code and permit language that did not match the EPA language. These changes that I'm proposing will align our city code as well as industrial discharge permits with the EPA language. So who does this affect? It affects our current permit holders. We currently have 6 permit holders within our city limits. This will also be in effect for any of the future industries that qualify a discharge permit that will come to town, or any of our current businesses that become large enough to become industries. Now to the fun stuff. So the first change is going to affect the permittees the most. Currently, we have in our language that says that if they exceed any of the parameters for local limits that's in their permits and our city code, that they have to repeat a resampling event within 30 days of becoming aware of that, which means when they receive a lab report. The language in EPA language says that they have to repeat the sampling and have the analysis done and submit the report within 30 days. So it's going to be a little bit of change for them. Besides just having the resample event, they're going to have to make sure that the city receives a report within that 30 days after becoming aware of the violation. So that will be the biggest change that will be visible to our permittees. The second one is just an addition of language. We have records retention in the permit and city code, but we needed to add in that it can be extended if there's any resolved litigation, or if the EPA or a state director deems that they need to keep more on site. And lastly, it's just a definition change. We currently have signatory requirements for permits and reports that are submitted to the city. On the one on the left is currently what the language is in our permits and our city code, but EPA had changed it sometime in 2005 or 2015, I forget which, but they changed the manager definition to the one on the right. I won't worry about reading it all to you. And so they want us to make sure we change it to the current language that's in the EPA. So what's next for me and my team is that after this commission meeting, we're going to be starting a 30-day public outreach to especially the permitted industrial industries in town. That way they are targeted to know that these changes are coming, and that they will be seeing this, and it will be implemented after council approves this all. We'll also have information on the website just to make sure the public will know that these changes are coming if anybody is interested. We currently are on the the agenda for city council to have our first read on November 1st and second read on November 15th. And hopefully we will be able to keep those days. I thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer.
Anybody have anything for Jolene? I got one thing for you, Jolene, but anybody else?
I might have something.
Okay, John.
Yes.
You want to go first or?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Jolene, I was just curious, each of the permits for the industries in town, do they specify a certain chemical list based upon what is known for them to use in their processes, or how does that work? Just out of curiosity.
Oh, no problem. Happy to answer that. So we have what are called local limits. Our water reclamation plants have their discharge permits that are renewed every 5 years. So about every 5 to 6 years, we look at what industries are allowed to discharge into the sewer system that will affect the water reclamation plants functionality and their permits to make sure they don't break their own permits. So we have a list of constituents in city code under standards for discharge, and we also have it in their permits that what they are allowed, which ones they're allowed to discharge at the quantity they're allowed to discharge, just to protect our plants.
And this is based upon, they provide you a list of compounds that they use in their processes, so you can go through and create that list, or how does that work?
Yeah, yes and no. So they do tell me what they're using, what chemicals they're using, so I have it on record in case anything new comes up. But for our local limits, we do a study. We usually hire an outside consultant to come in and do a vast amount of calculations. They take into effect like loading on our headworks, what's coming into the plants. So they do a lot of, and then they take all the data that we test for as a city, and the industries themselves do a bunch of testing. So they take all that data and they number crunch to see what we can handle at each plant to be able to be within permits.
Okay. Hey, thank you much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, John. Julian, I got two questions. One, we did have a serious disrupt, I'll say a month ago, but it really kind of took, I think it was Rio offline for a bit. Did that trigger one of these reporting occurrences? And the second thing is, I'm glad the government has helped to define things, but is it, I don't know the answer, but is it feasible for people to do the analysis, get the reports? Is that 30-day timeline actually feasible, or is it sort of, we're fooling ourselves? I'm just interested. So
It's, for the second question, it's both. So for laboratories, there can be hiccups there, but you can put rush on a sample that can get you a faster result, but of course it costs more money. I did have that conversation with the contractor that was here about that. Sometimes, there is a lag in laboratories, and he said that doesn't matter, that they have to get you the report within those 30 days. Otherwise they're in another violation.
Got it. Okay. And did we trigger one of those just a little while ago, or no? We didn't catch it.
So with the Rio plant, we still actually are trying to pinpoint where the issues were coming from. We investigated a couple possibilities, one being a permitted user, one not a permitted user, but one we keep monitoring. So we had discussions with both of them, and one of them, they did make a bunch of changes. So we're not sure if that has helped the plant, or if it's just because like the NAU came back, and so there's more flow, and so it's not hitting as much. So we're not exactly sure if it's fixed and what caused it.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Jolene? No? Okay, well, that process seems pretty straightforward then. Thank you, Jolene.
Thank you.
Okay, now item 4B, Stormwater Credit Manual Revision. Ed Shank. Ed, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, Commission. I'm going to try to share my screen. See if I can actually get it to work. My work laptop died. Let's see here. Okay, so we're going to talk today about the Stormwater Credit Manual. To give some background on that, it's been around since near the beginning of the stormwater section creation. The purpose of the credit manual is to provide incentives for residents and commercial businesses to go above and beyond the standards that are set by the Stormwater Design Manual or standards that are designed by state or federal regulations. We do get a small benefit from the community rating system, so CRS system within our FEMA NFIP, the National Floodplain Insurance Policy, for having a credit manual. The purpose for having an update on that manual is to remove some of the ambiguity and some sections that frankly just don't make a lot of sense. So what I'm sharing right here is the 2015 credit manual. That's the most recent version. And I've scrolled down to the portion that actually details the benefits that can be provided. So the first one in particular, and I don't know how we want to do this, if we should take it section by section and then have questions and comments, or whether we'll have questions and comments at the end. Either way works for me, whatever makes the most sense in terms of flow. Happy to do that. And then obviously the purpose of this first meeting is just to bring up the concept, and then we can continue to work on public outreach as we develop a more clear idea of how we want to make revisions. So at this point, this is still very much open for discussion. These are just the recommendations of staff within the stormwater section. So happy to take questions, comments, and take those to heart.
Yeah, why don't we go through the totality of all this, and then we can do questions, because there's some things that are interrelated and some that aren't, and it'd be good to see it all, and then we can plow through that. So
yeah, sounds good. And this should be relatively quick. So the first one that's listed here is detention basins, and essentially there's 2 credits that you can receive. One is a credit for detention basins that meet the current standard for the 2, 5, 2, 10, and 100-year flood event. And that credit is a 20% credit to your stormwater fee. And the other credit is for detention basins constructed between 1990 and 2000 that are only designed to attenuate the 25-year storm, and that's given a credit of 9%. Staff has an issue with both of these, to be honest. The top one, our issue is essentially we don't understand why we should provide a credit for something that's required under our current code. So right now that is required under our 2009 Stormwater Design Manual. And then the second one is even more problematic. Why should we provide a credit for something that does not meet current code? So essentially we're providing a credit for detention that's deficient. So our recommendation is to remove those 2 lines and replace it with a credit here. Let's see what I have. A 10% credit for detention basins that provide detention beyond the current code. So specifically, we would recommend changing those 2 lines to a detention requirement for a 500-year event, since we do have 500-year events delineated in our floodplain insurance studies, so the FIS. So that would be our recommendation. Remove those 2 lines and replace it with a 10% credit, which obviously that's negotiable. We could make it 20% for something that's above and beyond our design standards. So really getting to the intent of what the design or what the credit manual is intended for. Next section is low impact development, LID, and active rainwater harvesting, non-residential. At the moment, let's see here. Sorry, just came out of another meeting, so I'm running a little behind here. At the moment, there's a credit of 10% provided for LID or active rainwater harvesting, constructed to the 1-inch level. The credit may vary depending on the LID, not to exceed 68%. This also doesn't make a whole lot of sense at the moment, since that is required under current code. We do require the first 1 inch of stormwater runoff to be retained on site, not detained, retained. So again, this one has some issues because we already require that. Conservation easements, there is a 10% credit for conservation easements of at least 10 contiguous acres. At the moment, our issue with that is that there's not many parcels within the city limits that's going to meet that requirement of a 10 continuous acre for a conservation easement that would provide benefit for floodwaters. So we recommend making that less onerous, probably reducing that to 5 acres. That'd be open for discussion. We just essentially said half that requirement, but there could be some discussion of whether that should be looked at a little bit more comprehensively. Would you not recommend any difference for this development and implementation of a structured educational program? That makes sense. There's very few of those in the city. And then there is a water harvesting for residential development that at the moment, let's see here, this looks different. I keep reading different versions of credit manual, it keeps changing it. Yeah, at this moment, it just says the credit for the installation of rain barrels on all residential downspouts should be credited 10%. We would want to have a little more clarity on that. Are we talking about the 1,000 gallons as mentioned in the paragraph before? Or does it need to be a gallon cutoff, or does it just need to be on all rain barrels on residential downspouts? And reading previous versions of the credit manual, it was more specific. So we do recommend that it be provided a little bit more clarity. And then one that's not in the staff summary that we would recommend thinking about is a credit for floodproofing structures. So both wet or dry floodproofing. So wet floodproofing would be floodproofing the structure to allow the water to move underneath the structure without damaging the finished floor. Dry floodproofing would be to floodproof the structure to not allow any water into the structure. So that would be something that should be considered for either the 100-year event if you're within the FEMA floodplain, or the 2-inch and 45-minute event if you are in a post-fire impacted watershed. So something could be considered as above and beyond our current code for flood mitigation. Probably as similar to the rest of these sections, probably a 10% credit would be appropriate. With that, again, this is just a very preliminary discussion, so nothing set in stone by any means, really coming to the commission for questions, comments, and constructive criticism.
Thanks, Ed. Any question, comment, or constructive criticism from
or unconstructive? I'll take it all.
No, we don't have time for unconstructive, but anyway. Malcolm, I see your hands up.
Yeah, Ed, hello. A couple of questions. The original intent of both the detention and LID, which for the commission might better be referred to as retention, was to charge more to older developments that don't meet current standards. When you think about it that way, it makes some kind of sense. So I think what the city did back then was give a credit to the ones that met the current standards, thereby meaning that the older developments would pay more. But I understand where Ed's headed with this. So it's kind of an interesting question. How would you still, if you believe that theory, how would you still charge more to old developments that don't meet current standards? That, for instance, well, they generate more runoff, right? Both volume and peak flows. So how would you do that? This way here was one way, but it seems to be kind of a reverse philosophy. Maybe there's an opportunity, Ed, to if you scrap the credit manual, maybe you charge more. Now I realize that could also be an accounting nightmare, but you charge more per ERU to the older developments that don't meet the standards, since that was the original requirement. And then the second thought is, yeah, on that rain barrel thing, it looks like it's changed since my day. It used to say 250-gallon rain barrels. And again, I think I brought that up before, that the idea there was we knew that it didn't pencil out as far as the volume, right? The volume that you're getting out of 100 gallons is not proportional to a 10% credit. The idea was City Council wanted to emphasize and promote rainwater harvesting. So I think I saw on your staff summary you were proposing to go to 300 gallons. I can't recall. But I guess my only suggestion there is be careful, because again, the idea was to promote rainwater harvesting, even though there was a great deal of discussion on this at council, even though as far as the volume and the credit, they clearly did not make sense. But the idea was politically to motivate the community to do rainwater harvesting, and that's why it was 10% for 250 gallon was what the original document said. And those are my only suggestions, but think about that one where rather than just, I guess the bottom line is, if you just kill off the detention and LID credits, everybody's paying the same rate. So if you live in a development that all the runoff comes right off, one of the older ones in town, for instance, it just runs right off without any detention or retention, versus somebody who lives or has a development that meets the new requirements, whereas stormwater is more or less managed to our standard. You're saying they're going to pay the same amount. So I think that's kind of what rubs me a little bit, is like, hey, wait a minute, one of them should be paying more than the other. So think about that. That's all.
Yeah, it's interesting, Malcolm. To my knowledge, and I'll have to check with customer service, we currently do not provide this credit unless requested. So I'll have to check with that. So my understanding is they are all paying the same ERU rate at the moment.
Yeah, Ed, you have to apply with this document, right, to receive the credit. And that's another interesting question. How many people are actually getting this credit now? I know that back in the day that very few people were applying for the credit. I do recall that Ponderosa Trails Homeowners Association threw in for their detention basins and got a reduction for several hundred residents perhaps, but not a lot of people have actually applied, at least in the old days.
Yeah, and I don't think that's changed much. So yeah, it's just interesting to hear that it's a reverse psychology on this one. So it's something we'll have to talk about internally.
Hey, Malcolm, just for clarification, this is Gary. Where was the intent to have that difference in fee apply to both residential and commercial, like older versus newer, or was it really just geared towards commercial?
It's both, Gary.
Okay.
For instance, like I said, Ponderosa Trails Homeowners Association applied for the credit for every one of their residents. So it's both commercial and residential. Yeah.
Thanks for the clarification.
Okay, John, you got a question?
Yeah. Checking to see, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Forgive my ignorance, Ed. So this comes off like for a private resident, this would come off your stormwater fee, off your 10% would come off your building. Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. And that's where it gets a little tricky on our side, because, obviously we're going through this rate adjustment, which we're going to hear about immediately after this. And it gets very hard to do a rate model with some of these uncertainties in here, because essentially you're changing the bottom line of what your ERU population is if you start giving credits out. So we really do need to tighten up this manual, not just because we're hungry for money or something. We need to tighten it up from a policy perspective, because we need to understand what our rates are going to be, how our funding source is going to be for the next 5-10 years. And we want to get rid of as many unnecessary loopholes as possible, so that we don't have unpleasant surprises sometime in the future, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like I have 4 rain barrels. I hadn't a clue there was a credit like this in the book. So, and I was actually thinking about scaling up to a larger volume. Have you thought about, is there any credit on the potable water side of things for putting in, say, a rain collection? Because essentially you're preventing the use, because I use mine for irrigation. So have the two of you, departments got together and thought about that a little bit?
Yes, I don't know if Tamara's still online, but I do know that Water Conservation has a separate, on the potable side, they have a separate credit for rainwater harvesting. I believe it's for 1,000 gallons. So they have a much higher, much more stringent requirement to get a credit.
Yeah, that's a big tank.
Yeah.
Okay. The other, so I'm for the commercial folks, you're calculating the area the rain falls over, and that is so you calculate how much rain that is, and then calculate the size of the retention basin for a 500-year event. Is that how that's all done?
So for commercial, yeah, they have to, well, they don't have to do 500, no, but they, as part of their development, so they have to put in a drainage plan that shows that they can detain certain design storms as well as the LID component. So the LID component is the first 1 inch, and that is retention, as Malcolm mentioned. So that's a retention requirement for water quality. And I shouldn't say it's purely retention. I mean, it's meant to percolate into the ground. It's meant to actually be an environmental benefit. So the LID is the environmental side, the water quality side, and then the detention is the flood control side, if you will.
Yeah, okay, got it. I was wondering about that. Thank you.
So any other questions, Fred? And if you've asked a question, if you could unmark your hand. But any other questions, Fred? And I got one, and this probably goes contrary to trying to simplify, but does it make sense, to give yourself a range as opposed to a specific percentage? In other words, you've got one person that barely met the 500 year, then you got somebody else that comes in with a really amazing design, and you'd like to actually kind of give them more for that. Anyway, it goes against trying to simplify, but don't know if that makes sense, and have that as discretion for the team. Just something to throw in there. Just think about it. Because when you go to model, you can always assume that there's a certain percentage getting a credit, and then based on history, right? Yeah.
Yeah, something we can look at for sure. Maybe have a matrix or a table. That way it's defensible.
Yeah. The matrix.
And I have one other, this is John Nauman again. I have one other question. For the folks who have been in the flood areas and the west side, and Cheshire, Coconino Estates, and so forth. So you said there's a credit for installing some kind of a flood prevention barrier. So would that be like you could put up a 3-foot block wall? Is there any kind of information available as to what the credit would work for and what kind of thing you're recommending, especially for the residents of those areas? Because I was actually thinking about doing something, but I thought I probably shouldn't contact, and are there permits involved, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So again, this is just a recommendation. We do not have flood proofing in the credit manual at the present time, but it's something we've been talking about through the Stormwater Strategic Plan, which you'll be hearing about later this fall, as well as we've been talking through our flood engineering groups. So for both museum fire side and pipeline fire, of what makes sense in terms of individual direct assistance, whether that's a grant program or whether that's a credit. So I'm very open to comments on that. So typically a flood wall would not be true flood proofing by FEMA standards, or not by standards, by FEMA's definition. It'd be flood proofing the property, but the actual structure, that's usually what they're talking about in terms of flood proofing. So what flood proofing would usually be, like flood vents in your crawl space area or basement. So it allows the water to, instead of pond up against your house, it flows under your house. Dry flood proofing is, where you actually bring in sealant to seal your siding. You get flood-proof doors. There's a certain engineering standard for that. You better encase your basement windows if you have them. There's a whole series of standards, mostly developed in coastal states for hurricanes. So it has not been looked at seriously, to my knowledge, in the post-fire Intermountain West, but it's definitely something that we could work on to help formalize.
Yeah, I think that would be great for you guys to develop some standards, recommendations for people in these areas. I know I've had discussions with neighbors, what do we do with these sandbags, blah, blah, blah. And I think a lot of people are seeking advice on how to proceed in the long term here. So whatever you guys can do, and if they can get a little credit for it, that would be great too, I think.
Yep, great feedback, and we're definitely working on that internally, and always open for conversation and new ideas.
This is Robert Dilday, sir. Along those lines, you're talking about retaining runoff water, and is there available information source for the public if they're interested in like retaining their roof water more than just or their property water, and where they can use it so they could get the credit? But is there any information stream or place where they could get some ideas and maybe do some project and encourage them to retain the water in certain areas, like out of the flood areas before it gets there? So maybe that would be good for our entire water table. And but I don't think I've ever heard of anybody offering, other than a couple barrels or something, if there's anything else that is available that a person could invest in, and then they would be able to apply for the percentage off because they prove that they're retaining water, So is there a resource for that?
Well, there are larger things than rainwater barrels. Their cisterns are still, obviously, they've been around for millennia. And I know some people in Flagstaff who have cisterns, so stormwater cisterns. I think probably the best source of information for that would be Aaron Young and Tamara Lawless. I know they do run a rainwater workshop or several workshops, mostly focused on rainwater barrels, but I do believe that they have some alternatives that are larger scale. I'm kind of speaking out of turn here because most of the rainwater harvesting has been done by the water conservation side. But definitely something we can look more into.
Well, it's also when a guy is doing a project, whether it's something like Pine Canyon or these multi apartment buildings that are being built, is there any requirements by the permit process to encourage water retention? Because that'd be a hammer to get that done.
Yeah, so at the moment, it's mostly what we require is detention. That's in the Stormwater Design Manual. You can do retention. You're just going through our permitting process at the moment of development. So that does go through Doug Slover here at Stormwater on that section. We are hoping to revise the Stormwater Design Manual since it is from 2009. And that is actually underway right now with Woodson Engineering as our design consultant, working with the stormwater section, and Gary Miller as the water services engineer. So that we will look at that retention area as well, see if what the current design standards are for Coconino County and Maricopa flood control district, which is the two areas that we probably look at the strongest for revisions.
In the permit process, is there any encouragement or recommendations that maybe like reduce their permit costs and so on if they do that?
Not that I know of at the moment. Gary, you might want to step in on that, but to my knowledge, we don't have any incentives for retention.
I think that would be advisable. I think it could get something going that maybe nobody's thought of, it could be a big deal. I don't know. Well, thank you anyway. I appreciate the information.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one other, this is John Nauman again. Ed, so there's two forms that you're looking at, retention and detention. And the first one you talked about was retaining amount of water for a certain period of time, and that's to essentially contain pollutants that may be coming off of roofs and other things, and keeping it from getting into the stormwater system and ending up in like, you know, the middle school pond or the wastewater treatment plant, correct?
Yeah, so that's the low impact development standards, LID, and the purpose is to retain the first 1 inch of runoff from your site. And essentially what it's trying to do is the most polluted runoff that you're gonna have off your roofs, that first flush, we're hoping to retain or filter on site. And then you get into the detention requirements, which is more the flood control requirements. So detention needs to be able to drain within 36 hours. Retention is more of what you would consider, you know, that ponding type effect, you know, wetland swale kind of thing.
Do you have like a standard list of contaminants that you find in that first, you know, gush of water that comes off roofs or from residential or commercial sites? Is there a list of things you look for at all, or is that just too broad of a thing?
Yeah, we don't actively monitor for that within the city. We do have our MS4 permit done through Steve Camp, but that is really just for outfalls into waters of the US. So it's just a handful of outfalls into the Rio de Flag. But in terms of on-site, so residential or commercial on-site, we do not actively monitor that. I mean, there is quite a bit of science on it in terms of what types of pollutants, but as you expect, it's quite variable depending on what type of rooftop you have, what type of driveway, parking lot, what type of leaks, etc. But it's your typical what you expect, you know, a whole range of hydrocarbons, some heavy metals, etc. And then what the concentrations might be really depends on the non-point and point sources.
I'm just curious, I'm sure it's in the literature out there, but say if you were to compare steel, aluminum, asphalt, shingle roof, shake roof, you could probably look at that, and actually I'm guessing you know, an aluminum or a steel roof would be a lot less polluting, but I'm not sure about that. Could that involve a credit down the road, or has anybody thought about that?
Yeah, we haven't really thought about that. It's possible. It definitely required quite a bit more staff resources to look at that, but that's definitely a thought.
Yeah, it's just curiosity. I know that I'm thinking about switching from one roof to the other, and that's just an aspect of it I hadn't thought about. I was more doing it just because of longevity, and rainwater collection is better. You don't get all the garbage from an asphalt roof if you have an aluminum or steel roof, and that probably have the same effect on stormwater, or if you're collecting the water to use it for another purpose. So.
Yeah, good point.
Okay, thank you.
I'll write it down. I'll look into that.
Thanks, Ed. I think if we have more questions or comments on this, I'd like to table those until the end, because we've got a lot of material to cover still on old business, and also with our very valued guest for today's meeting for our informational section, which is the flood control district discussion with Andy Bertelson here. And we're very honored to have Andy join the discussion, but I want to make sure we leave time for that. So so if we have time at the end and there's more discussion points, we can hit that. We'll circle back around, right? So Ed, we'll have you then move into section 5, old business, which is a stormwater rate assessment update. So take it away.
All right. Just jump from one to the next. All right. So thank you. and we're going to give another update on the stormwater rate assessment. You're actually going to get a little bit more detail today. And we have our rate consultant on board here, Sanjay. So Sanjay is going to be giving half the presentation. Very similar to last time. I'll start it off, give some of the background, and then Sanjay will step in with the actual interesting part, and then I'll wrap it up, and I'm sure we'll have some good questions and comments here. And we also have Rick Tatter for management and finance side. So hopefully he'll take some of the heavy hitter questions and I'll take some of the easy ones. That's the hope. Can everybody see the screen? I'm sharing that PowerPoint screen.
Yeah, but if you could
Yeah.
go into screen show mode, that'd be great.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we
Is
go.
that better?
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yes, but
All right, so quick overview will provide the results of the stormwater rate assessment. Some of the discussion points will give a little background on stormwater. Malcolm, feel free to correct me as we go through that. Provide that purpose of the rate adjustment again, the rate basis and our policy recommendations, a timeline for moving forward with this rate assessment, and then request some feedback from the commission. So we came up with this slide. This is just really hoping to show some of the change in level of service from the stormwater section through time. So the stormwater section was created in 2003 as a relatively small group within community development, really focused on FEMA floodplain management, development review, construction inspections, a little bit of maintenance funding, and some water quality aspects. In 2005, we had our first rate change and our first credit manual, and added some funding for capital improvements, so drainage improvements, DRIP at the time, as well as the drainage investigations that would go into updating that list of needed drainage improvements. 2007 is when we really started doing some master planning. That was the beginning of the NEMAD studies. Actually, that's redundant there. Beginning of NEMADs, the Northeast Area Master Drainage Study. 2009 is really when the flood alert network, which is the rain gauges and stream gauges, really started growing. We had one or two before then, one at Peakview Street, that was the earliest, but we really started growing that rain gauge network. Also the LID ordinance, so the low impact development. 2012 is when the voters approved the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project, which was mostly, almost entirely done in the fire department. But that did mean that there was more of an overlap with stormwater, with larger watershed management, both Dry Lake Hills and also down Lake Mary area. 2018, the Rio to Flood Control Project was finally fully approved, which led to a new rate that went into effect in 2019. That rate mostly covered the debt servicing for the city side of the Army Corps project. 2019 is when we had the museum fire, also the climate action adaptation plan, and real funding for that Rio to Flag project. So quite a few new things that were dropped into the stormwater section. Also, maintenance operations was moved out of public works and into water services under stormwater, which required quite a bit more in terms of asset management and GIS servicing. 2021 was obviously a big year for flooding, which led to the stormwater section taking over quite a bit of flood control responsibilities in terms of regional flood management. And then obviously this year with the pipeline fire was when we really start talking more about the individual direct assistance, which goes into that flood proofing. And then a big item, which we'll be talking about today, we're really starting to get into the business of regional detention basins, which is a great thing. It's really good to see. But with the development of regional detention basins, there's quite a bit of maintenance that goes into those, especially ones that are impacted by the post-fire environment. So we're talking about quite a bit in terms of sediment and debris removal. So kind of summarizing that quickly, the utility structure for Flagstaff, for the stormwater section, is quite complex. Here's just a list of many of the duties that fall within stormwater section, going from what is fairly common to see nationwide. So NPDS, MS4 is very common, outreach and education, drainage development review, construction inspections, etc. And then we get to things that are a little less common that you normally see in other sections, divisions, or other government agencies. And that would be the regional studies, regional flood management, post-fire response, regional watershed management, things like forest thinning, water supply management. And something that's really being stressed quite a bit from the FEMA side lately, which is natural beneficial floodplains, what they call natural beneficial floodplains, which we already are ahead of the times with our rural floodplain ordinance. There's a great little study that's put out by Western Kentucky University, Campbell and Bradshaw last year. And this gives this is one snapshot from that study, and it gives some of the stormwater utility fees nationwide. So stormwater at a nationwide level is pretty rarely a utility on its own. There's about 2,500 stormwater utilities out there, which sounds like a lot. But when you consider the fact that you have over 20,000 NFIP communities, so National Flood Insurance Policy communities, we're talking about only 10% of the communities have a stormwater utility. Many of them, the stormwater section is wrapped into either engineering, public works, or some other funding structure. But what we're looking at here is the funding for stormwater utilities, so where they have their own utility rate. The larger the circle, the larger the rate, the smaller the circle, the smaller the rate. The majority of these stormwater utilities are based on the ERU system, which we are as well. So that's the equivalent rate unit based off of impervious surfaces. So as you can see, some areas have a much higher stormwater utility rate than we do at an ERU level. So some of the reasons for this rate adjustment, obviously we've had an increased amount of fire and fire severity in the area, and the number of flood events both in the fire area and outside of it. So from climate change as well, we're seeing some of those more rare flood or rain events happening more frequently. So that's making our current infrastructure insufficient throughout most of the city. Also a very large increase in demand on our operations, both staffing and equipment. We spent over $1 million this year just on flood response. Last year was also a big year. And that was just in the pipeline fire area this year and the museum fire area last year. Mitigation costs for the new flood areas such as Spruce Wash and Schultz Creeks are, as I mentioned, very high. And then we have still some deferred CIP projects from that 2010. That's when it finished, NEMADS. So it started in 2007, ended in 2010. The majority of those projects are still unfunded, just due to the increase in costs and increase in needs that we have throughout the community. So the completion of these critical capital projects will reduce our flood response operation costs, and that's really what we're shooting for. We're hoping to design our way out of responding every year in terms of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of response. So take that response off the table, replace it with appropriate capital improvement projects, and hope that we can move on from there. So our current rates, that's at $3.74 per ERU, gives us limited capital funding, roughly $600,000 a year. We also have a large increase in our operating costs, both from flood mitigation, flood response. What's missing in this bullet is the new detention basins. And currently, this is all essentially unfunded, and it is a rather unsustainable budget. Sanjay will be going into a really nice slide about that later. Should say not a very illustrative slide, put it that way. Our proposed rates will increase that capital funding to allow for some permanent flood mitigation. We are looking at both scenarios here. So a scenario where the general obligation bond that we are going out to voters with in November is funded, and a scenario where that bond measure is not funded. So we're looking at both scenarios on that one, and it will allow for funding some of the increased operation costs that we're talking about. So the detention basins, as I mentioned, pre-season flood mitigation, so some of the sandbags, barriers, direct assistance, more staffing and equipment for what we need to do, and then more master planning. To be honest, since 2010, we have not had the funding to do more master planning, and that is needed to understand our long-term issues. So it will provide a more sustainable budget. Okay, so right here we have the purpose of the rate adjustment in terms of capital proposals. So this is our 7-year horizon. So you can see a few line items. We kind of bundled them by type. So we have the Rio to Flag flood control project as the top line item. You can see a lot of that is actually debt servicing in the next several years. Our spot improvements, so these are spot drainage improvements. So pretty heavy next year, this year, and then it kind of tails off. Post-fire projects, both in the museum area and the pipeline area. and then other capital improvement projects as identified under NEMADS or similar smaller studies. So basically deferred capital improvement projects that we know of that we have not been able to get to due to lack of funding. So here's a map of those bundles. You can kind of see that they're spread throughout the city. The green dots are the areas either under NEMADS or other areas that we know of that we had deferred capital improvements. The pink dots are the museum fire. As you can see, most of those are along the main stem of Spruce Wash. We have 2 yellow dots for general bundled areas for the pipeline fire. And then also some Rio de Flag points, mostly in the downtown area. All right. Sanjay, are you taking this one or am I taking it? I can finish this off if you want.
I thought you were going to take it.
I'll take it. All right. Sorry about that. So yeah, again, to talk about that rate basis, we are on an ERU system. That is the most common stormwater utility type system out there. So that's based on equivalent rate units. Here in Flagstaff, 1 ERU is equivalent to 1,500 square feet per impervious area. So we do actually have to determine our impervious area, which we do roughly every 3 years. I wish it was every 3. It usually extends a little beyond that. And we'll do that through aerial survey. So LiDAR, light detection and ranging survey, as well as ortho imagery. And then we will take that and we will determine the amount of impervious surface that we have in GIS, and then give that over to customer service to update our ERU population. Right now, our residential properties have a maximum of 5 ERUs. The average residential property has roughly about 3 ERUs, and commercial properties do not have a maximum. We do propose through this rate adjustment to make an update to the policy, so change the maximum of 5 ERUs for residential properties up to 10, and we can do that through this rate adjustment process. And the purpose of that is to be more equitable to the rest of the residents, to not artificially cap it so low that there's a portion of the population that are being under taxed, if you will. Okay.
Thank you, Ed. So now I'll take over the presentation and talk about the financial plan. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me clearly. Ed, can you hear me?
Yep. Sound great.
All right, thank you. So the operating cost is increasing substantially by $2.2 million in 2024 next year. And the main challenge is the detention basin. It's that additional cost that's needed. As Ed mentioned, we're hoping that by doing this aggressive program, we can defer some of this future costs. And we also have capital expenditure that's occurring over the next year to deal with all the fires that we've had in the last few years. And over the next 7 years, that's $12.7 million. So a mixture of different types of sources of revenues are being used to fund these capital projects. The first is revenue bonds, second is geo bonds, grants, and then rates cash. Now, one of the big unknowns, or one of the things we're hoping for, is the November election, the geo bonds to be voted. If the voters approve that, it's $26 million worth of these projects will be funded by property. If they're not, then those projects still need to go forward, except that they will be funded by stormwater fees. And I'll be showing you both of those scenarios. Next slide, please, Ed. So these two tables here shows us the anticipated expenditure level. The top one shows us the operating budget. The first line is what you consider the traditional O&M budget that we've had at 1.8. There are some one-time costs this year, and then it drops to 1.4. But we have additional needs that's needed, different levels of services that are needed because of the fire detention basin being one of the most significant one. And that's in that additional O&M. So this additional O&M cost covers personnel, capital, pre-season flood mitigation, as mentioned, and of course the detention basin. Ed talked about the different capital needs out there, and then this shows us the mix of funding. how much of it's going to be rate funded, how much of it's going to be revenue bonds, how much of it's going to be grant funded, and how much of it's going to be GO bonds. The GO bonds, as I mentioned, that's $26 million in total. That we're hoping for would be, the voters would approve that, and that would be on the property roll. If not, then that $26 million of GO bond would be then a rate revenue, and then the stormwater fee would pay for it. So now I showed you this graph last time we met, and let's just go over it again. The bars are the different revenue streams coming into play. So the orange one is what the revenues from stormwater fee, roughly $4.4 million. We have a little bit of grant money in 23, 24. That's that blue color. We don't know what the future is with grants after that. So we're anticipating no grants. If we do get grants, that helps us, of course, and eases the pressure, but we don't know if we will receive that. In addition, you see that darker orange color or brown color starting at 24 onward. That's the GO bond revenue coming in if the voters approve it. So we take that into account. So those are all the different revenues. And then the shaded colors in the back are all the expenditures. The first one is the operating revenue that we have. Then we have the current debt. Then we have the proposed debt, because I mentioned we are issuing quite a bit of debt to fund these projects. And then we have the capital expenditure, the teal color. The lines now are the ending balance. The black line is the ending balance and showing it's a negative slope, which is not good from a financial perspective. That means we're drawing into our reserves. And as you can see, it goes below zero in 2026. The dotted red lines is the target that we want to achieve. We are on the reserves. The reserves are based on two policies. One is a 25% of revenue, which you currently have. We are recommending to have an emergency reserve and build that up to $2 million in the out years. That won't start in the beginning years. That's more in 27. But just in case if something happens, we have some money in the bank to deal with an emergency. So next slide. So as you can see, the current revenues are not sufficient to deal with the flood situation that we're having and the stormwater needs. Significant rate increases will be needed to deal with that. And as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at two scenarios: one where the GO bonds are approved, so then some of the capital, 26 million, is funded by property tax, and the other one where it's not approved, and that means all those projects have to be rate funded. So the next slide now shows the actual proposed rates. We worked with staff. We went over many different scenarios associated with that. And these are showing you the ERU rate. So the current rate is $3.74. That's what the current is. And then it shows you what each rate would be starting in January. So in January 23, if the voters approve the GO bonds, then this proposal would be $6.55. If the voters do not approve it, then that means we need to fund that through stormwater. That'll be $8.42. You can see the fees out in the out years. It does jump quite a bit in the first 2 years, and that's because we're funding all this operating costs, all this capital project. So it has to ramp up quite a bit. Then in the out years, it sort of stabilizes and it sort of smooths out. You can really see that in the increase, the next part of this table, where you see the $2.81, the difference between the current and the proposed, or the $4.68. And then you can see in the out years that it's more manageable in the sense of it's 35 cents or 30 cents of an increase.
And Sanjay, that's a monthly rate?
That's a monthly rate, correct. And I
Yeah.
will be showing you customer impacts towards
thanks.
the end of the presentation, but this is just one ERUs as discussed, or maybe not mentioned. 3 ERUs is the standard for a single family. So now we're going to show you the financial picture of this. So this is with the GO bonds approved. If you notice that one of the things you'll notice, that black line now is not negative sloped. It's sort of hovering above the red. And then in 2029, that's where I started to look at it, 2028, is I want that black line and the red line to be parallel to each other, and the black line ideally slightly above the red line. And that's what we achieve. So we get to a quote unquote steady state in some sense, where revenues and expenses are equalizing and we're maintaining a reserve balance that's healthy, and we can deal with unanticipated things that may occur. Unfortunately, one of the things I think we all realize now is the unexpected will occur. We don't know what that is, of course, because it's unexpected, but something will happen in this next 6 years. We know that. And so by having these healthy reserves, by dealing with this, we can deal with that, whatever the next thing is. Hopefully it's not a fire, but if it's a fire, whatever it is, we can be prepared financially to deal with it and address it quickly. Next slide, please. So now this is if the voters do not approve it. One thing you'll notice quickly is that the stormwater, the GO bond is not there anymore. Now it's all stormwater revenues. And you also notice that the orange bars are much more higher now because we're absorbing it through the stormwater fee. And again, I'm trying to get to that steady state in 2029 where the black line and the red dotted lines are parallel to each other. When doing large projects, we need to have the money on hand to award the contracts. And that's why sometimes the reserves are a little bit high and then they drop down and they move around a little. Next slide, please. So now, we've talked about the financial challenges, proposed rates, the financial condition, of course. What does this mean to our customers and in the community? So this is a residential, and as mentioned, this is 3 ERUs. That's the standard or typical one. We have the current, we have the proposed, we have the monthly, and then we have the annual. So in scenario 1, with the GO bond approved, it would be $8.42 a month increase. Scenario 2, without the GO bonds, it'll be $14. And then you can see the annual change too. Next slide, please. So the next slide shows the commercial average big box. These are these very large Walmarts, those establishments, and they have 220 ERUs. So you can see that the current $822. With the proposed, it would go up to $1,439 under scenario 1 or $1,815. And then you can see the monthly increase associated with them. Remember, these are large volumes of revenues that are coming into these places and hopefully profit too, but in the sense of their business. But these are the costs associated with the commercial ERUs. We also have the restaurant. The restaurant average is $14. You have the current at $52.36, and then the proposed, and then the monthly change there too of $39.27 for scenario 1 and $65.45 for the monthly.
So Sanjay, these are changes that are net relative to ERU, yet if the bond does go through, you're still making a bond payment, right?
Yes.
As a citizen.
Correct. So that is correct.
And so which is the relative cheaper way to do this then?
From from a financial perspective, it doesn't matter, right? If you do a GO bond or you don't do a GO bond, right? Because it's still getting paid. It's not one or cheaper. From a customer impact perspective, the older established households, the people who've been, I'm thinking through this, and maybe Rick, you may be able to help me out here, because the property value would be assessed. It would be assessed on property value, and in the property value, it's a question of the correlation between property value and ERUs. And I think those are positively correlated. I would think they are. So more value your house is.
I think space is space, right? 3 ERUs doesn't matter what your house costs, but the question is how much bond gets associated with those. Anyway, it's worth a question, or it's worth a quick look, maybe down the road, not today, to kind of figure out, because customer impact, at the end of the day, you got to pay that 12.3 at the top.
Right.
It's either going to be you pay it direct or you pay it through that and a bond, right? I mean, that's, yeah, okay.
Yeah, either way you're paying it. It's just that 3R, if you're a wealthier house or a nicer house, you may pay more of that GO bond, even though it's a
Gotcha.
So that's where I was going with my thought process. So it would put more of the burden on more expensive real estate than the less expensive. Next slide. So now what's the survey of this? And so what we've done here is we've normalized it to 1,000. You do charge based, your ERUs is 1,500, but because of all the different agencies out there. They all charge us slightly. We normalize to do 1,000. You'll notice if we go all the way to the left and work our way, you'll see Flagstaff. That's your current. You're one of the lowest, as you can see. And then with the proposed, that's S1 and S2 with the highlighted. Those are the two different scenarios. So you'll be more in the middle. One of the things, as Ed mentioned, is that stormwater, the level of service, the requirements varies with communities. Some communities focus more on water quality issues, some more flood, and such as yours. So it's a little bit all over. So the ones that are more expensive tend to focus more on water quality issues. I think I'm turning it over back to Ed now for the next slide.
I got a little question on that last slide.
Yeah.
How come there's two Flagstaff entry?
Yeah, so there's two slides those are the two scenarios with the geo
there
bonds.
is? Oh, is there two of everything there?
No, it's just, so there's the current, you see how if you work your way left,
Yeah.
maybe Ed, you can use your mouse to point for me, or it says Flagstaff current, that's your current ERU, current 1,000. And then you have the Flagstaff S1, which that's scenario 1 with the geo bonds approved. So the $26 million is on the property roll. And then S2 is where the stormwater pays for it, so it's more expensive.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay. So moving forward, what is our timeline here? So we did go with our notice of intent back in August. We're having that rate analysis report right now, as well as the Water Commission meeting for that report. The documents will be posted on the Water Services website tomorrow, and that will begin our 16-day public notice. We will have community outreach to a number of different groups in September and October. Copy to city clerk will go in a month from now, so October 15th. We'll then have our council work session on October 25th with a newspaper notice the next day. Our first public read will be on the November 15th council meeting. Our second read and the ordinance will be on November 29th, so after the elections. And then we will have our rate effective January 1st. So just going over that a little bit more. So the newspaper will be a public hearing notice. We will have a website for that rate adjustment. We're gonna have to create that, which will include the rate analysis report, FAQs, and e-newsletter. We will have both a virtual and in-person open house. And then we'll have a number of road shows like we are doing for the bond right now to different local organizations. And with that, do we have any questions?
John here. I have a question about ERUs for residential and how, could you go back to that slide and redefine that for me again?
Sure. Which slide were you thinking of?
Oh,
This one?
yeah, I think that was it right there.
Okay. So what clarification would you like?
Well, I'm just, so the more ERUs, the more you pay, or is it a set? How is that? I'm sorry, I'm getting educated. This is new stuff for me. So
No worries, no worries. So how it is we have the impervious surface unit or impervious surface layer that's created in GIS. We then parse out by parcel the amount of impervious surface that each of those parcels has, and then we can do a quick conversion by unit type. So let's say you had 3,200 square feet of impervious surface. Well, that would be, rounding down, that would be 2 ERUs. If we had something closer to 4,200 square feet, that would probably be rounded up to 3 ERUs. And then you'd pay per ERU. So right now we're paying $3.74 per ERU. So if you had those 3 ERUs, which is our most typical size house, then you'd be paying 3 times $3.74, so about $11 per bill on that municipal bill. So that's where we are right now. And we have roughly 100,000 ERUs out there in the population. I don't know the exact number; it fluctuates, but I could talk to customer service and determine that.
And currently there's a cap for residential properties of 3 ERUs?
No, currently there's a cap of 5.
5.
And the majority of residential properties are 5 and under. There are, as you expect, it's kind of a exponential drop. So there's a handful of 6s. I'd have to pull it up. I think there's a couple hundred properties that have 6. And then there's maybe 50 that have 7. And then it goes down very quickly, 8, 9, 10. And then there's a handful that are over 10. But by handful, I mean literally maybe 2 handfuls. We're talking just a few very, very large properties. So essentially, the majority of residential properties are 5 and below, though we do have some 6, 7s, and 8s, as well as obviously 9, 10s and on up. So our purpose in raising that ERU limit is to be a little more consistent with what we're seeing nationwide. Most stormwater utilities do have an ERU cap. Most of them are roughly around that 10 limit. If you are talking about 1,500 square feet, again, you have to normalize it. Some communities have a smaller unit, they're talking 1,000 or 500 square feet per ERU, and some have much larger. But if you were to normalize it, most of them have a cutoff of around 10,000 to 15,000 square feet of impervious surface, and above that, you're flat rated, if that makes sense.
Okay, I would support raising that cap to 10 for sure. And you determine the impervious area using radar, or
yeah. So
that would be like the roof, any cement or asphalt on the property, basically, would go into that square footage amount, right?
Correct. So it'd be a roof, any accessory dwelling units, accessory sheds, so any rooftops. Yeah, if you have a patio, deck, sidewalk, driveway, those are the majority of your improvements. When we can, and usually we can, since we're hand checking these, if there's a trampoline or if there's a car that's parked off into the grass because you got home too late or whatever, we don't count that. So we really try to determine what's a permanent impervious surface versus what has just temporarily been thrown up that we just happen to capture on that flight.
Okay, and is that reflected on a residential bill?
It is. So there is a line item on your municipal bill for the stormwater fee.
Okay. But it does, and that's based upon the ERU then?
It's based on the ERU. I haven't gotten a paper bill in years. I get it digitally personally. I have to check. I don't believe we actually state the number of ERUs on that bill. I think it's just a stormwater line item with the number that goes with that.
Okay, but that's the basis for that fee. So.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Hey, thank you much.
Any other questions for Ed? I got a couple. We'll go ahead. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Malcolm. It's just an observation for Ed and Sanjay. The bond thing was in the newspaper the other day. It was just kind of a line item, and I saw stormwater and I saw sewer, so on. I was trying to think about it from the perspective of a community member, a citizen of the community, and whether or not I'm going to vote for this. And of course, you have, my full support. But I'm thinking that you need to come up with a specific list of what you're going to do with the money. Now, I know that there's increases in maintenance and staff and that kind of thing. But if you want the bond to pass, you need to say, hey, we're going to build A, B, and C. Now, that's something maybe that was in some of the budget information, Ed and Sanjay, you provided, but you need to distill this down in order to be successful, in my opinion. You need to say, we're going to build A, B, and C. And then people are going to go, oh, yeah, that's from that flood. Oh, yeah, we got to support this. So that's just my 2 cents. That's all.
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. And that actually is in the handout for Proposition 441, which includes stormwater, but it may not have been in whatever the newspaper article was in. So in the handout and on the website for the bond, we do actually have a map of Spruce Wash, because that's where that 26 million would be going towards. We tried not to call out too specifically what those improvements would be, just because we don't know exactly how far that funding will take us. But we do have a map that goes from essentially Linda Vista down past Dortha to Killip School, and then also shows the drainage way down to Route 66. But good comment, and I'll definitely follow up with the bond team to see if they can't provide a little better publicity on that.
Ed, this is Kurt. I got two things, and Rick, Mr. Tatter, maybe you're involved in this one. So two thoughts. First one is, I come from a commercial world, and when I see a 10-year plan where revenues and costs are just flat, we would normally be asked to leave the room because it's like, where is your cost savings plan? You can't. We're never allowed to just run consistent. It's like you've always got to have a way to drop that cost because of profit pressure, which is not. This is a different world, but. To that end, how do we demonstrate to the public through this plan that we are not just building, it's the old government thing. Well, I got to spend it on August 31st because I get my new budget or I lose it. That kind of attitude and that kind of thing, I think would just incense the people of Flagstaff. So how do we ensure that's not the case? The second part is, which group is responsible to really go through this with a fine-tooth comb and say, yeah, these are things we absolutely positively need versus, oh man, that'd be nice to have, right? Because this is not the time or place to be doing a lot of nice to have. And this is not an accusational statement. It's just a question. How does that process work? How do we double, triple check that these are all must have for the benefit of our citizens? And is that between the department and Rick's team, or how does that work?
Yeah, great question, Kurt. And I'll try to take it, and Rick, feel free to jump in. We definitely agonized on this. I'm not going to lie. There's a lot of unknowns moving forward, and the biggest unknown that we have is the detention basin clean out. So we have these very large detention basins going in, Killip School being one, Parkway Basins being another, and then obviously that 20-acre parcel on Schultz Creek being extremely large, as well as Francis Short Pond. Essentially Francis Short Pond is acting like its original intent back in 1923. It's acting as a flood control structure. So there's a lot of need moving forward, but we don't know what that need will be. We did get some cost estimates from our JOCs, our job order contractors, which were very eye-opening in terms of what it costs to clean out those basins. So we tried to provide a risk assessment for annual cleanout. What's the risk of a full cleanout being needed of one of those detention basins versus a dry year like 2020 where we won't see anything, and try to annualize that cost. And that's where we came up with that $2 million per year, which is frankly quite a bit lower than what the cost estimates were coming in as. And the reason we went with that lower cost was, one, we thought there'd be a very reasonable chance that those watersheds would slowly recover and we'd have capital improvement projects upstream that would start straining out some of that sediment. And also we'd have dry years. So the hope is to annualize those costs, and in those good years, we can roll over that $2 million into essentially the bank, if you will, so that we have a larger fund balance come a really bad year, like a 2021 year, so that we can fully fund the maintenance obligations that we are going to have. The problem with detention and retention, if you don't clean it out and if you don't maintain it, you just lost that function. So unfortunately, it's not a nice to have. It's a necessary thing in the post-fire environment. We absolutely have to clean out those basins if we want them to function. Otherwise, if we do not, and they are full of sediment or water, even if they're retaining, and we have another flood, there's going to be a pretty pretty large newspaper article the next day in terms of what came down the pike, just because we won't have that capacity if we don't do the maintenance. Going to the capital side, that's a lot easier, to be honest, because that we can actually design, we can engineer, we can look at the risk assessment much easier than we can operations and maintenance. And I always say that we took a really fine comb to it, and we'd really try to take out anything that looked like a nicety. We really tried to make sure that anything that was on there from post-fire all the way to deferred capital from NEMADS and earlier were things that were absolutely needed for life and safety and weren't just a nuisance flooding issue. But definitely hear your concern. I think it's something we're going to hear a lot of, especially as we go on the road tour. And it's something we will have to be sure to address correctly. So good comments.
I think you can highlight, we can sort of inoculate some of those discussions by getting ahead of them with, here are a real clear, crisp discussion around these are the design philosophies that we had, and that we are safeguarding Flagstaff's money. We are trying to do the ultimate, the things that are exactly necessary and no more. And anyway, you get the gist. I think we'll help ourselves as we go to market, if you will, with this proposal. So it's I've had to do that in several former lives, and I can sit with you one day and help you with that if you want. But anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think you have a great comment there. Great questions. And I really appreciate hearing it, to be honest. So we'll try to tighten that up for the roadshow for sure.
I would ask for more questions, but let's try to limit that to 5 minutes, because I want to make sure that we have enough time for our discussion. And with Andy and Brad, I think you forwarded some questions to Andy for discussion. So, but anybody else have anything for Ed, please?
This is Robert. Oh, I'm sorry.
Ed, I think it's really good that you're holding that $2 million a year for cleaning those retention basins. I've heard all kinds of nasty things about what's going on in Doney Park with their retention basins, basically full of mud and not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that is bad publicity, I can tell you, and bad management. It's just poor management. So good planning.
My question was in the retention basin too. So if before you can clean the mud out, you got to get the water out. What do they do when they pump the water out? Not to add to downstream problem. What do they do with that water? How do they handle that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it really depends on the detention basin design. So which particular detention basin we're working with. So in the case of the Schultz basins, I believe you had a question earlier of where we are with that. So Fan Contracting is actually doing a great job. It's 3 basins. 2 of them are mostly mass graded out. We've got the phone going.
Okay.
Hey Burke, can you mute yourself because your phone's ringing?
Yeah.
Thanks. So yeah, just a very quick update. So we have those 3 basins at the Schultz Pass, or not Schultz Pass, sorry, at the Schultz Y. 2 of them are mass graded right now. We're working on the 3rd, moving very quickly. Fan Contracting is doing a great job. We should be able to wrap up within a month, both mass grading and fine grading, head walls, concrete, etc. So what we're doing with that particular detention basin is we have 2 outlets. So one would be your seasonal flow. So basically snow melt, small storms, local storms, whatever. And that'd be a 30-inch CMP, so 30-inch corrugated metal pipe. And then we have our outfall, so our actual designed outfall, and that's another 30-inch CMP. And then we have our emergency overflow structure, which will be a weir structure with riprap. And that's for any flow that's above what those 3 basins can take. So essentially you have 3 outlets, one for your nuisance flows or seasonal flows, environmental flows, whatever you want to call it. One that's your main outflow for draining the detention basin so we can actually get down to the sediment to clean it. And then the emergency overflow structure. So the purpose is to drain those within 36 hours. They are detention basins, not retention. So drain them within 36 hours. Obviously, it's going to be a muddy bottom, but hopefully we can get some clear skies in there so we can get loaders, graders, etc. in. And we are surveying in control points. So when we bring in those loaders, graders, etc., there will be GPS control points so they can run with an RTK GPS to get it back to the original grade.
Super. Thank you very much.
So does that
Thanks.
mean those retention basins will be fully operational in about 30, 40 days?
They should be operational by this fall, correct?
Super.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed. Okay, let's, in the interest of time, move. We'll close it now. If we have more time, we can circle back if anybody's got any questions for Ed. But let's go to our item 6A, which is flood control district discussion. And Andy, are you here? And we want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
So, Mr. Chair, let me update you. So after Mr. Bertelson reached out to me to be on the September agenda, he subsequently, after Marion sent out this agenda, reached back out and said, hey, he ended up having a conflict and would like to come to the commission at their October meeting.
Okay.
I then told him an update on the conversations that both City Council and the Water Commission have been having. And as you just alluded to or referred, I did forward him the list of questions that the commission came up with at the last meeting, at your August meeting. And then he plans to be prepared to answer those questions. I had asked for them to get them in writing first, and then we'll forward them to the commission, and then he can come and talk to them, or we'll see how he does. But he actually regretted and needs to punt until October. So we will also, one last comment on that, we'll make sure he has more than 30 minutes on the agenda for next, so to give the commission plenty of time to get your questions answered.
Yeah, that's excellent, because I was a little worried.
Yeah.
We have a lot of ground to cover on that one. So.
I was just so excited that he had reached out to want to come. So we just put him on at the end of the agenda. But yeah, next time, once we confirm that he'll be in October's meeting, we'll ensure that he's front and center on the agenda.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. So having said that, then, are there any, Ed, you may be back on the hot seat. So are there any other questions for Ed on the topics that he's covered, since we were sort of holding that to the end if we had time?
Hey, you guys, can I ask a question about what Brad was just talking about and Andy?
Sure, please do.
Yeah, two things. I'd heard Brad say that council had been discussing this. So if that's correct, what has council been saying? And then two, I think my thought process is that when Andy comes back, let's just say he demonstrates that the district has been spending money within the city fairly. Let's just say that's the scenario. Or in other words, in either scenario, one thing I would probably want to do is make a recommendation to council that there be some kind of a committee, steering committee, I don't know what the word is, but some kind of a way where the flood control district can meet with us, as well as perhaps City of Page, City of Williams, to look at the budgets going forward in the future. So if there's any support for that at the next meeting, again, no matter what Andy says, I think just in my gut, there should be some way established of communication with the district. Clearly, there is none now. So I would want to make a recommendation to council. Now, if that were to happen, I would suggest we put this on as a new business item so that we can make that motion, because under, I don't know about the rules, Brad, but under what I think would happen, if it stayed under informational items, we wouldn't be able to make a motion to council. So if that's correct, I would suggest on this item, we put it under new business so that we can, if we want to, we can. Does that make any sense, or am I wrong?
No, Mr. Chair, Malcolm, that's exactly what I was thinking of doing, is putting it under new business and giving the opportunity for the commission to actually vote one way or another, a recommendation to council. Yeah.
Thanks,
then let
Brad.
me clarify. Yeah, and Malcolm, let me clarify your other comment. I may have actually misspoke. So council hasn't had a agendized conversation on this topic. They're at the notice of intent, the stormwater council's August 23rd meeting at the notice of intent. There was just some brief conversation about it, but not agendized. And so we had just provide the link to that meeting so the county could at least see what little bit of conversation they've had on this topic, and then specifically on the stormwater rate topic.
Yeah, and just Brad, just to maybe I'm off here, but I think Malcolm, one thing that was discussed was, and maybe this is what you just meant, but also getting somebody on the flood control, the county board, so that we have we being Flagstaff, the larger we, have insight, have input into what's going on, since we're probably the largest contributor to that fund in the county, I would think. So I don't know if that's part of what you're thinking, Malcolm, but yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking, is that going for, again, no matter what Andy says, what the outcome is as far as the money they've spent or not spent, as we move forward, there needs to be some way to communicate and help prioritize their budgeting for all the money we're spending. Yeah, what you said, Kurt.
Which is really what you said. So that's awesome. Okay. All right. Anybody else have any other questions for Ed on the topics that he covered? Or any other informational items to or from the chair, commissioner, staff?
John Nauman here again. I wonder if Ed or Gary could give us an update on what's happening with the stormwater issues at 180 and Schultz Creek.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in on that. So we have a design consultant, Shepherd Westminster to SWI. They're working on 3 different concepts for future improvements of that culvert. We do have to deal with private property rights for all 3 concepts. So basically it's 3 different alignments that would get the water from Schultz Creek at 180 to the Rio de Flag. Roughly, we're looking at post-detention basins. So after the detention basins are in, relieving the 100-year flood event downstream of that, because we still have the same volume of water. We just won't have that very high peak that we have right now. So we're going to still have to mitigate that volume of water under the highway and to the Rio de Flag. So we're working on that. Probably be a series of box concrete culverts, and then some of the concepts involve an open channel concept, and some are purely a box culvert from 180 all the way to the Rio. So we're working that with SWI and hope to have those concepts available for city management and potentially city council to make a decision upon. Funding wise, we are still working with Stacy Breckler-Nags on potential funding for it through different grant opportunities. So some of those are at the state level, some are at the federal level, and still working that angle. We'll say none of the 3 concepts are cheap, especially in today's economy. So I think the cheapest one is a little over $5 million by the engineer's opinion of probable cost. And unfortunately, it goes up from there. So as mentioned, they are not cheap options in today's economy. Also, we're going to have to do some value engineering because of the lack of concrete in Arizona. So there is value engineering going into it for alternatives to concrete boxes. So there's some pretty innovative designs out there in terms of molded aluminum. So that is something that SWI is also looking at.
So essentially, probably nothing will be in construction for several months up to a year, it sounds like.
It's really hard to say. It really depends on a number of factors, but because there are property rights in play, that does substantially complicate matters. But we are working on that with our real estate side as well as our real estate legal. But they really won't be able to ramp up until we have a concept that's approved.
Yeah, it just seems to me that for residents of Coconino Estates and maybe further down, that the sandbags really can't come down until that problem's resolved.
Yeah, that is kind of our standing communications at the moment, is until that culvert is replaced, there is still a flood risk from the detention base, even with the detention basin in place. And part of that risk is what I mentioned earlier, is if we do have back-to-back storms, there's the detention basin benefit will be a lot less for that second storm.
Yeah.
So until we have that culvert in place, that's really a long-standing permanent fix. I shouldn't say fix, mitigation. The detention basins are an amazing mitigation strategy, but there is more risk involved with a detention basin versus a conveyance, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed. Great presentation on the other stuff too.
All right, any other questions and or informational items? Okay. All right, well, everybody, we'll give you back 20 minutes and then we'll move to item 7, which is adjourning. So Miriam will show that we're adjourning at 5:40, and thank you, everybody. And thanks to all the staff members for really great information. And Sanjay, thank you as well for all the work you're doing with the team to get us ready for the future. So thanks, everybody, and have a great evening.
Thank you all. Thanks, Kurt.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.